R.D. Godrej is joining us. He's chairman at the Godrej Group. He's joining us to take some questions on what he's making of the macro developments and how the industry is viewing all these things. Mr. Godrej, it's a pleasure to have you with us on the channel. Good morning. I just want to start with the move by the Rajasthan State Government Council of Ministers, the Cabinet, to amend some critical central labour laws. These changes will require the centre to sign off on it. But how do you view this, sir? Let's begin with that.
The law is such that you cannot close down any unit without the state government's okay, which is a bit absurd. It should be left to the company concerned. And of course, fair compensation should be mandated.
Will other states follow Rajasthan's example? What's your sense?
Of course, there are many other labour restrictions that can also be reviewed.
Just to ask a more basic question, in your experience, how big a challenge are the current labour laws for industry as it operates right now? And can you be specific? What are those things which you consider as big challenges, big impediments?
Well, there are many. There are all sorts of restrictions currently. There are all sorts of permissions required. Too much goes into courts, etc. So I think a general overhaul, a simplified labour regulation would be very helpful.
I just want to go on to the other thing, which is the APMC Act, which has been amended by the centre in Delhi, and it's advised states to actually do the same. The change has been to take out perishables, fruits and vegetables out of the APMC Act. What is your reaction, sir? What will be the impact according to you?
No, I can't say whether they will do it, but they ought to do it. Because currently, the prices which consumers pay for fruits and vegetables are several times, sometimes 4 or 5 times what the farmer gets, which is some of the highest ratios in the world. That leads to consumer price index inflation. And I think now the Indian diet includes, because of better standards of living, more importance given to healthy nutrition. I think the diet contains much more fruits and vegetables than in the past. And I think this is a very important move. It makes no sense for perishables like fruits and vegetables to be covered in the APM Act. In fact, ultimately everything, the Act itself should be reviewed. But at least fruits and vegetables, perishables, should be removed from it at once.
You know, we're also essentially seeing a situation where at an aggregate level, prediction by the Met Department is calling for a 7% deficiency as far as monsoon rains go. Do you think it's possible, and God forbid we see a repeat of 2009, where rains were deficient, food inflation spiked substantially? What else do you think the government can do right now to limit the possibility that we see a repeat of 2009? What else should the government do according to you?
First of all, I disagree. The monsoon predictions are not anywhere as bad as in 2009. In fact, generally the monsoon is expected to be around the 95% level. Of course, ultimately, whether 95 could end up into a very good agricultural production if the temporal and spatial distribution is positive. On the other hand, even 100% could lead to a poor agricultural season if the temporal and spatial distribution is poor. So we have to wait and watch. Also, there is a fear of an El Nino, but now more and more we are getting international reports that El Nino, if any, will be a weak one. So I don't expect too bad an agricultural season this year.
Fair enough. I mean, but anyway, you would agree that food inflation has been high for far too long, right? I mean, it was a big election issue as well. What else do you think the government should do to tackle it, apart from what it has done, which has changed the APMC Act in Delhi?
Well, I think they are already looking at doing that. Seeds which need less water, or crops that need less water, should be preferred. In each crop, the type of seeds where harvesting can be done earlier should be preferred. And if we make these adjustments, I think the drop in agricultural output can be minimized.
Mr. Godrej, the union budget is around the corner. I'd just like to ask you, how is the government going to show a smaller fiscal number, which is generally the expectation that they will better what the last government put out in terms of the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP target for fiscal 15? Number will be smaller. With monsoons likely to be deficient, cutting subsidies, etc., an option? Cutting expenditure. And when you talk about expenditure subsidies, is that an option at all, or you think it's going to be very tough?
No, I don't think so at all. First of all, it is clear that growth orientation is extremely important. So incentives for saving, incentives for investment, incentives for production, fiscal stimuli should be a major part of this budget. Now, if in doing that, if they feel revenues are going to reduce a little, then there are two ways to tackle it. One is to cut subsidies where they are not required urgently. So, for example, wasteful subsidies. Even middle class, upper class people get subsidies on things like gas, for example. So, all that can be well directed. But much more importantly, disinvestment and privatization can be paid tremendous attention in this financial year. So there's tremendous opportunity to raise funds by the government through sale of assets, be it public sector companies, be it government shares in private sector company, be it land. So that's a tremendous opportunity. Just listing LIC can raise a large amount of money for the government, for example. So there are many opportunities which should be planned not only for this financial year, but the next 2 and 3, so that fiscal deficit is clearly contained, thus inflation would be contained and growth could be encouraged extremely strongly. And I'm sure the government will do it.
Right. Mr. Godrej, you said incentivizing savings and investment. Specifically what, in terms of measures, could you be specific?
Well, for example, there are incentives in the Income Tax Act when you save, when you invest, etc. Those should be increased. The slabs at which higher rates of income tax apply should be increased so that people have more money to spend. That will create more demand for goods. Excise duties in certain cases should be reduced so that production can increase. They did reduce, for example, the excise duty on vehicles in the interim budget, which has had a very good effect. And similarly, it can be done in other industries. Now, first of all, I don't think by reducing excise duty rates, revenues will come down because economic growth will pick up and that will take care of the revenues. But even if it does reduce revenues, we must go for privatization and disinvestments to cover that deficit, so that fiscal deficit is also under control.
Mr. Godrej, you are strongly in favor of a fiscal stimuli for the industry, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's very necessary. Other industry growth over the last year has been 0 to negative.
Yeah. You've been sort of part of the pre-budget consultations with the government. You've met officials, the top officials. Can you tell us, and I know you can't be specific, but is the government receptive with the idea of fiscal stimuli?
Well, that's very difficult to tell because during this period, government rather listens to people rather than express what they're going to do, and that is the right way of going about it. But I do hope they do it. I think they should do it. All the indications are that the government wants to get growth restored early.
Right. Mr. Godrej, and this is purely because of the lack of choices at this stage, right, near term. So if you want to stay within the fiscal boundaries, the only game in town is actually disinvestments. And some have complained and said that, well, selling PSUs is like selling capital assets to fund revenue deficits. How feasible is this in the long run? What's your view?
No. Government assets are so huge that if you sell a little bit of it to finance revenue deficit, there is no problem. You do it, you create a good fiscal situation, you create good growth, then the value of the remainder of your assets goes up very considerably. So you can continually do it for 20 years and your remaining assets will keep appreciating. Sensibly done, it can be a very good way of creating a win-win situation.
Mr. Godrej, from the real estate space, would you like to see anything specific in the budget?
Yes, I think first of all in real estate, the biggest thing they should do is to make sure the states clear permissions for real estate development quickly. Today there is tremendous delay across the country. I think the central government should ensure that the state governments clear projects at an early period. Also, the right kind of incentives should be given for people to buy housing, for people to save for housing, etc. Entire structure of increased savings, investments, and expenditure should be looked at.
Yeah, but what you're talking about are more administrative things, right? Can something be done specifically in the budget for the space?
No, the permissions is administrative, but there is some fiscal incentives that need to be given for real estate development to accelerate.
Mr. R.D. Godrej, thanks very much for coming on. Great talking to you. And thanks as always for your perspective on the industry expectation before the budget.